Good morning, everyone. Good morning. This is Melinda McClymans, and I am hosting the Keys to Understanding the Middle East podcast through Ohio State University's Middle East Studies Center. And I have a very special guest here, Professor Naomi Brenner, who is a Hebrew professor at our university. And she teaches Middle Eastern literature. She teaches Yiddish literature. She teaches, of course, Hebrew literatures. She teaches modern Jewish cultures. Her most recent book is Lingering Bilingualism. And right now she's focused on popular fiction in Hebrew. She does a lot of collaboration. One of our projects right now is about the feuilleton, which is a section of the newspaper from the 19th century that was popular in the 19th century. And she's really spearheaded our Jewish studies majors and minors, and there's a lot of really exciting opportunities at Ohio State University in regard to Hebrew and Jewish cultures. So I'm really pleased to have you here, Dr. Brenner. And I should also mention you got your PhD from the University of California, Berkeley, in comparative literature, and your BA from the University of Michigan in history, comparative literature, and Jewish studies. So so welcome.
Thank you, Melinda. Thank you for the invitation. It's so much fun to be here today. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Yeah, and I thought we could focus on the immense diversity of Israeli society today. And I'm really interested to hear more about how you're teaching that, especially through the media like film, television, and things you're doing that, in your classes that are really engaging students and opening their eyes to really how diverse Israel is.
Yeah. Well, let me tell you a little bit about what I'm interested in, especially when it comes to the diversity in Israeli society, which is a really fascinating topic. At Ohio State, I teach some courses on Israeli culture. I have colleagues both in Near Eastern languages and cultures and in the history department who also teach about Israeli history or Jewish culture, all sorts of different topics that intersect. But for me personally, one of the ways I found that has been really effective and really thought-provoking when it comes to looking at Israeli society and how it's been changed over the last almost century at this point is through film and media. I work on literature as well. My own research focuses primarily on literature, but here sometimes the differences between literature and film are, well, yes, they're different kinds of media, which is to say the way you read a book or a short story is different than the way you might encounter a film or a TV series. But at the same time, we're looking at ways in which fiction and stories can represent people's lives, societies, historical events, all of these things as they unfold. Of course, there's an entire area of documentary film that is fascinating, and there are brilliant films there too. I have to say I focus more on the fictional side or the feature films, which I think is more what we'll focus on today. But for me, it's a particularly engaging and also useful way of kind of a window onto another culture. And I find that both in my own work, but especially when I work with students or when I work with community members, I teach in a variety of different contexts, that watching things often opens up great conversations and really allows people to look at different perspectives when it comes to things like a diverse society, which Israeli society certainly is.
Yeah, and I think stories connect with people and kind of also allow you to get into more nuance about the diversity and of course break stereotypes, but also just talk about kind of the reality on the ground in a way. What are your thoughts on that?
Definitely. I think it's always dangerous to make generalizations, but I'm going to start with a kind of generalization, which is these days, I think we do live in a very visual world. Some of that is the nature of our digital world, which is, especially over the past year or so much has been mediated or done over the computer, over the internet. But we're also really used to seeing things, seeing video, seeing pictures. And in that sense, I think that film is a really familiar medium these days. ways, perhaps
Yeah.
more so than literature for some people. And it can really bring you into another place, another time, or the same time, just in a radically different perspective. And I think that is one of its most powerful aspects, especially as we as viewers, or me as a viewer, I'm so used to taking in things visually that I think it does work really well as a way to kind of open up a story and invite the viewer in. Whereas these days with text, some people love reading, and so that is as natural as a feeling to them, which is to enter the world of a text as you read it on the page.
Mhm.
But as we listen to audiobooks, listen to podcasts, watch things more and more, I think we're increasingly used to different ways of accessing other worlds. And I think film is a particularly good way of accessing another world. And that's where I think for an American audience or for an English speaking audience, foreign films can be so powerful because they really have the ability when they are well done. And there are so many good films these days. I've got to say, it's an amazing thing to be living in the age of digital filmmaking, which makes this technology so much more accessible and so much more possible to people to be able to film things on a high level. But it lets people in. And I think that's incredibly powerful.
It is. I think it's a great way to teach about culture, especially when you do it critically and sort of then step back and break down what you just saw and think about it in terms of representation. And I like that you're focused on the evolution of film for the past 100 years. What 100 years to focus on in terms of the changing demographics of Israel and the changing relations and perceptions of Palestinians and other Arabic-speaking communities around Israel. Can you speak to how that's evolved in Israeli film?
Certainly. I think going back to a little bit earlier in your comments, one of the things that strikes me is that in teaching films, or even just in viewing films, it can be really powerful, not only to put films in context, say in a social context or in a historical context, all of which is really important, even within the context of sort of film studies or the technology of film, which has evolved dramatically over the past 100 years.
Yeah.
A little bit more, but also juxtaposing films can be really effective. So whether that's juxtaposing Israeli films or films made by people who will define themselves as Israeli, but will represent very different politics or very different views of society, or juxtaposing Israeli and Palestinian films is something I often do in my class. And I think that's really effective too, in terms of thinking about how a film is not just filming reality, but it's a point of view, it's a perspective, it's a story that's being told from a certain point of view, or from a certain person or people. I think that's really effective. But to get back to your other question about kind of the historical span here, I think one of the fun things, and this is how I actually always start out near the beginning of the semester when I teach Israeli film, is that if we look briefly at the history of film technology, and no, I'm not going to go into detail. I'm not going to bore everybody with this, although it's a great story for anybody who's interested in looking at how technology evolves and so quickly, honestly. But it's really not until the 1890s that the various technology is in place, not only to capture images, and here we're talking about moving images, film, right? Photography has a little bit of a different story and a bit of an early one. But by the 1890s, we have actually, researchers, inventors, scientists, both in Europe, especially in France, but also in the United States, working on capturing moving pictures. But one of the keys is not only capturing a moving picture, but it's also figuring out how to show it to other people, how to capture the images and how to project it. And so among the first to do that are the Lumiere brothers, two French inventors in the 1890s. And as soon as they figure out how to efficiently enough or effectively enough for their time record these moving images, and then how to project them to a paying audience, right? The how to make money off if it comes very quickly as well. One of the first things they do is they send out teams of filmmakers. I mean, they send out people with their really rudimentary video cameras that they've just created to different spots that they think will be appealing to their French viewers. One of those spots is the Holy Land. So we have footage from dated. It's this crazy story. But it's really, really old film. I mean, again, this is way before digital, so everything's done literally on film. Some of it disintegrates. It depends how it's stored. But these canisters were found in some French person's attic not too long ago, maybe 15 years ago. They, preserved them. They opened them up. They found they have street scenes from Palestine in the 1890s, so Ottoman Palestine at that point. The Jerusalem scenes are breathtaking. You see the diversity. You see people walking around the streets. It's this amazing view. But again, it tells us something both about this emerging technology. So what do the Lumiere brothers want to do? Well, they want to make some money. And how do they make that money? They want to show things that they think people are going to be interested in seeing. And in that moment, and of course, this is coming from the perspective of kind of Christian Europe and a Christian perspective coming out of France, but the Holy Land is one of those places. Not the only place. They send, again, teams to multiple places. So what's remarkable is that we have this footage. And if you actually Google Lumiere Brothers Jerusalem or Lumiere Brothers Palestine on YouTube, you can find it. Different people have it. There's some better prints. Prints. But nice. You can look at this. I mean, it's silent film, very
So if you Google it, you can watch the footage?
You can. YouTube.
Oh, wow. Nice.
No rights or issues here about, streaming or various things. It's all in the public domain. But it is fascinating because I think, again, it shows us not only the power of film to entertain, the power of film to take these, French viewers and, later it'll expand beyond France as well, and show them a part of the world that the majority of them will never see in their lives. Right? And it's fascinating to read people's reactions to these really early moving picture images, but also to think about what it means for us. At this point, 120 something years later, right? We are well beyond those early moments. But suddenly, what does it mean for us to see actually moving pictures? There are plenty of photographs of Ottoman Palestine. So it's not like this is our only visual opportunity to see it. But one of the things that's so striking of a sequence in the film that's the camera, these early cameras can't move. They can't swivel. They can't tilt up and down. They're just fixed because such a process to put them on there. So literally the camera is parked in front of Jaffa Gate, which is one of the gates to what is now called the Old City of Jerusalem. And it just takes in the street scene. And some people are looking at this, trying to figure out what this was. Other people are just going, you see men mostly, but you see some women too. You see people clearly with different dress coming from different religious and ethnic traditions. You see, well, in the 1890s, you see something that history tells us, which is Ottoman Palestine was a very diverse society. And what's remarkable when we're looking at this historical scope is that you see it from the earliest films that we have. We see that captured on film. It changes over time, and both the nature of that society will change over the decades and over the century as film changes. And also, the society that's being recorded changes. But I would say diversity of various kinds is actually a constant that will run from those earliest films up till the present day.
Yeah. So that's a profound kind of primary source to learn about diversity, and not to think of it as necessarily just about globalization and immigration, but also as something that can be quite stable over time, in terms of, I guess, the amount of diversity, although that diversity, the makeup of the diversity might change. So, and also you've touched on perspectives a lot. So I just want to pull back to the concept of the Holy Land for a moment, because we have a really broad audience. We've, got people tuning in from all over the world. And could you explain how that is a Christian perspective for our audience?
Interesting. So, I guess that takes us back to, if we're going to stick with this example just a little bit longer, but I'm happy to give more examples too. Why do these French inventors, the Lumiere brothers, why do they think that their audience, who are predominantly Christian, in France, chances are that they're Catholic, but there I am speculating a little bit. But why do they think in the 1890s their viewers want to see Palestine, Ottoman Palestine at all? And I think that tells us something about the place of Palestine and what for the Lumiere brothers and is quite common in European narratives from the 19th century. Is referred to as the Holy Land, which is Jerusalem is in a central way the city of Jesus, or if not really the city of Jesus, it is one of many sites within Ottoman Palestine at the time in which individuals can retrace the steps of Jesus and other things that are narrated.
I apologize. There was some kind of interference. Let me turn off my mic, and then if you could go back to how it's the city of Jesus, there was some interference.
Okay, sorry about that. So, for Christian viewers, I think the appeal of the Holy Land or Ottoman Palestine in the 1890s is to see the land, what was perceived by many as the land of Jesus. I don't think that was the only motivation. You have many narratives of pilgrims of all kinds, but Christian pilgrims as well, who travel to what they consider the Holy Land and retrace. They go to the Sea of Galilee, they go to Jerusalem, they go to other Christian holy sites as they've been identified in that area, and they write about it and bring it back. And suddenly this is kind of it's even better than a visual postcard. There are actually many postcards that are exchanged in the late 19th century also as an interesting form of media, people going and taking pictures and mailing them back. Suddenly this is new technology that is like one better, or maybe it's not one better, it's different, because suddenly people can see these places for themselves. I mean, I think another reason why, as we're in the 1890s, but even in the early decades of the 20th century, individuals are interested in seeing moving pictures coming from Ottoman Palestine, is that we are also in a time of colonialism, and both France and England will have vested interests that will come more to fruition, which is to say they're going to be more active as colonial powers in the Middle East after World War I. But even in these decades leading up to World War I, again, I hope I can give a little bit of history without getting so that people can follow, but know that there's a much richer history here. The Ottoman Empire is kind of limping along at this point. It's no longer at the heights of its power, but it does control this entire area. But clearly the powers that be, and again, these might not be the moving picture viewers, but there's interest in countries like France, in countries like Britain, about what's going on here. And then within the Jewish world, again, the Lumiere brothers are not really creating here film for Jews specifically, although certainly French Jews may have been among those to go see these images. But by 1910, 1911, we have the equivalent of sort of home videos. At this point, the technology of film has changed dramatically enough that individuals with some means, not just everybody off the street, could buy a video camera, could buy what we would call a very rudimentary video camera, but that they themselves can start recording footage. And so we have some old footage, a little bit from the teens. There's one from 1911 by Murray Rosenberg, a British Jew, who goes and kind of takes, it's terrible quality, but again, you can see this stuff. He's doing it because he is a Zionist. He is somebody who wants to advocate for the creation of a Jewish homeland. They're not talking in 1911 about a state at this point, but what is called a Jewish homeland in Palestine. And so he's taking these images as one way to show his fellow British citizens, British Jews, but not only British Jews, what this place looks like, and to make the argument for Zionism. And so in that sense, I think there are many different ways in which this sort of footage, even though, I mean, it's not what we would call a feature film at this point, right? There are no stories, there are no narratives. It's just like you go on vacation, you take some pictures, but it's still so new. it has a big impact.
Yeah, I can imagine, and that's right. Like in Lord Balfour's statement, he calls it a homeland and never mentions the state. Um, could you maybe just touch on that, like in terms of like what the political Zionist movement, what that was for our audience?
Sure. My colleague, Professor Dai, in the history department, I think does an entire semester on, what is Zionism and, the state of Israel. But to give a kind of brief take on Zionism, which will underlie a lot of the films that will be made in Palestine and then in the early years of the state of Israel. So that really will accompany us through much of the 20th century. Zionism is a political movement that emerges in the late 19th century, although there are lots of scholarly debates about when the political movement itself emerges. And it builds on, well, a couple distinctive trends that are going on kind of more generally in the world at this time or in history. First of all, it draws on a sentiment that might be called kind of longing for Zion. This is a deeply held sentiment within the Jewish tradition. If you look at the Jewish liturgy, so prayers that are used in Jewish synagogues, from centuries ago up to the present. If you look in the Hebrew Bible, you see different manifestations of this. But that is a belief that the Holy Land, or what we would call Palestine, historically Ottoman Palestine, when Zionism first emerges, was a land that was the Hebrews or the Israelites in biblical times, and later on Jews. There's an interesting historical transition that goes on, but was their homeland. And this goes back to the sovereign Israelite kingdoms, King David, King Solomon, etc., in the ancient past. And so that there's a longing for Jews to return to Zion that goes along with the belief that Jews live in the diaspora. Jews are spread throughout the world, don't have sovereignty over themselves. And so there has traditionally been lots of sentiment and prayers that are return to Zion. That, though, becomes mixed in with a very modern thing, which is to say modern nationalism. In Europe, throughout the 19th century, a little bit before, but especially if we look in Eastern Europe, where we have very large Jewish populations living in difficult circumstances, we have the rise of different ethnic nationalisms, ethnic cultural nationalisms over the course of the second half of the 19th century. And so Zionism, much like Polish nationalism and Ukrainian nationalism and Romanian nationalism, is part of a modern movement that defines a national homeland and eventually a nation state based on particularly national identities. So those two, there are more strands, but those are two main strands that come together with the creation of Zionism as a modern political movement to establish a Jewish homeland. And that later will be transformed into a Jewish state in what in this period would be Ottoman Palestine, and then after World War II would be called British Mandate Palestine.
And that is actually a pretty decent segue back to what our goal was to talk about today, was like the film things, in terms of like what is an Israeli citizen, like, it kind of has this history and these two sentiments you're talking about, but then it evolves a lot to include, well, the Jewish diaspora all over the world and very different cultures coming together. So, yeah. So I'm not sure if I have a question formulated on that, but it seems like a good segue.
I think it is, and it might be a good opportunity to fast forward a little bit here too. I find the history fascinating, which is why I always enjoy talking about it. But if we kind of recognizing that we're skipping over an awful lot and we fast forward, might as well use film metaphors, right? If we're talking about but if we fast forward from the early decades of the 20th century all the way into into the 1950s, 1960s, maybe 1970s, but we move in. So there are a couple things that happen to make that fast forward. First of all, film technology is changing, right? You get, not only do you have cameras that can now move and film in more sophisticated ways, but you get color. The early stuff's all black and white. You get sound. All of these technologies are coming in. Although it takes quite a while for some of them to get to the Middle East. In Israel, as is the case in many other Middle Eastern cinemas, films are actually in black and white for longer than they are, say, in Hollywood or in the United States. So interesting to think about how regionally or in certain geographical locations that the intersections with technology can be a little bit different, and sometimes it can just be expensive or challenging to get your hands on some of this. But the themes also change. Now, of course, this is a period of time in which this idea of Zionism, which was very preliminary at the beginning of the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, really comes to, well, from a Zionist perspective, comes to fruition with the establishment of the State of Israel. Also very complex political situation that comes with several wars, including the War of 1948, that is very traumatic for all sides involved. But then when we look at these films, they're no longer kind of trying to make the case for the establishment of a state, which many of the early kind of Zionist films do, but rather they're trying to film a new society. And they're filming that society from, like I've said many times, from different perspectives, but also it captures how this society changes radically. Now, one area of films that I'll mention now, but I'm happy to come back to if you'd like to later, Melinda, is there are a lot of films that focus on war. And that's not surprising, given that we have not only the conflict of 1948, which is a difficult one, and a bloody one that leads to the establishment of the State of Israel. But there are, it's hard to say. I mean, yes, there are wars that are recognized, say, in 1956, in 1967, in 1973, but that's not to mention kind of low-scale conflict that goes on all along. So a lot of Israeli films deal with war and with conflict, and it's really interesting to watch that evolution. When we're talking about Israeli society, though, I think it's also really important to look at films that deal with immigration. Now, Israeli society is a society that is a complex one because it involves not only, let's say, the individuals who are living within the bounds of the new state of Israel in 1948, when there is an armistice, which is give or take. The numbers are here a little bit tricky, but as long as you don't, well, bear with me with the approximate here, but there are somewhere in the area of about 800,000 citizens of this new state of Israel. Approximately 80% of them, or maybe a little bit more, 80 to 85% are Jews, and the other 15+% are Arabs, both Muslim and Christian. This is in 1948, 1949 with the armistice. But that society changes radically in the next decade because you have the population is doubled by the first kind of massive wave of immigration, what's called the period of mass immigration into Israel, which is both Jews who are Holocaust survivors in Europe who leave what are called displaced persons camps, who are sitting in camps in Europe, no longer concentration camps, but they're refugees in Europe, and they en masse kind of immigrate to this new country of Israel. But you also have a huge migration of Jews from Arab and Muslim countries, so what are often called Arab Jews, who also come to the new state of Israel. And of course, that means that we have, in the span of approximately 10 years, from 1949 to 1959 or 1960, we have the population of Israel doubling. And but it's doubling with a remarkable variety of immigrants. So yes, you have immigrants who are coming from Europe, from Russia, from Poland, from France, from Germany, from all sorts of different places. But they are actually dwarfed by the number of immigrants who are coming from the early ones, coming from Morocco, from Iraq, from Iran, and so on and so forth, from many other countries as well. And the tendency in the early days was to kind of lump them all together. Either they're European Jewish immigrants they're talking about, or Eastern immigrants. They were actually called Oriental immigrants in those days. That terminology has shifted considerably. And that glosses over really the diversity, like it matters if you are an immigrant and you're coming from Morocco and maybe you're from a Berber village living up in the mountains or in the desert somewhere in rural Morocco, or if you're coming from an urban location in Morocco, or if you're someone coming from what was a very wealthy and well-established Jewish population in Iraq. Say you've lived in Baghdad for centuries and you're coming. So even within that, you have many different immigrant stories, but they all come together in a new nation that's actually trying to create the infrastructure and all of the necessary structures for a successful country. One of the films that we see, it's a pretty well-known film, is Sal Shabat from 1964. So it's made a couple of years after the immigration itself, which is this first wave of mass immigration is the 1950s for the most part. But it's a satire. It's actually hilarious. I mean, even though it's kind of old fashioned, and when my students watch it, I say, be patient. It takes some time. It's a little bit slow. It's still in black and white. But it's both funny as a satire, but it's also kind of sharp. It sharply criticizes a lot of aspects of Israeli society. And there it shows kind of tensions between the old guard, which is to say Israeli citizens. And here the focus is very much on Jewish Israeli society and how they, the people had already been living there and perhaps had been born there, felt like they knew how to do everything right. And then you have this mass of immigrants who don't necessarily agree. So it leads to lots of comic situations, but many of them have a pretty sharp edge also. And that's a really important representation of a society in transition, what it means to have such a huge percentage of immigrants in such a short amount of time.
That's a great resource. And I just want to make sure I'm getting it right. Is it Sal Shabati?
Yeah, Sallah, and then S is the first word, Salah, and then Shabati, Shabbati. And it's a film that, it is a film that's dated in some ways. It shows that it's from the 1960s in some of the ways that it stereotypes different groups. I mean, it stereotypes them oftentimes for the purposes of its satire, but sometimes the stereotypes are also pretty disturbing in their own right. But it's really interesting because, for example, we see there Salah is the main character. He is clearly an immigrant from an Arabic-speaking country. He's dressed in what you could say kind of vaguely traditional garb, although you can't fix what country he's from. He speaks with a heavily accented Hebrew that has what is intended to be a kind of Arabic accent to his Hebrew. And he's made out to be a buffoon. He's made out to be a fool, although in the end, he probably, he's a lot smarter than he appears. But it is, from our vantage point, let's say in 2021, it's a problematic stereotyping of the Arab Jew and the immigrant more generally. But the satire actually makes it more complex because it's not always clear in satire what precisely is being satirized. So I think some of the stereotypes are being made fun of even as they're being perpetuated in that film. A really interesting film, a really important film too.
Definitely interesting. And just a note on terminology, like when we talk about Arab Jews, you said, you mentioned something about there's also like an idea of an Eastern or an Oriental Israeli. And I've also heard the term Mizrahi. Is that the same thing? Also the Sephardim or the Sephardic Jews. And it'd be great if we could just kind of like clarify what those words mean and which are appropriate and which aren't appropriate, because our audience might not be sure.
Yeah, I'd be happy to, because here I think we can see how we understand, different groups within society and how that understanding changes and shifts with time. So, back in the 1950s or the 1960s, when this film that I've just been talking about is from, at that point, most people would have said the equivalent of either Easterners, which to me is a little bit more neutral, or Orientals, which to me, again, has a pejorative sort of sense to it. Oriental has been used in different ways, I think, in English. In this context, Oriental in Israel was used to refer to Jews who came from the Middle East, North Africa, and other Muslim countries. And again, was often used as a way to look down on them. I'm not sure everybody using that term back in the 1950s meant it in a pejorative term, as in a way, but I certainly wouldn't use that these days, and I don't think most people would now either. So as time has passed and as people have kind of taken a step back and thought about what it means to talk about different sectors within society, whether it's because of immigration, because of ethnic background, because of different cultures and traditions they bring, or language, right? All of these things are markers of different groups within society. There has been both, I think, an evolving sense of labeling of terminology, one that has shifted towards the term you brought up, Melinda, which is Mizrahi. Mizrahi means actually Easterners. It just means people from the East, but it is perceived to be a kind of much more inclusive umbrella term rather than a pejorative one. But I think increasingly, I think as both how people look at societies and how people look specifically at Israeli society have changed. We recognize, I think, even more diversity within those groups. Mizrahi might be an umbrella term, and it's quite an effective one. I mean, when we look at Israeli society these days, if you look at the give or take 75% of Israeli society that is Jewish, right? So 75% of Israeli citizens are Jewish. Within that 75%, more than half of them are what we could call in English of Middle Eastern origin, or in Hebrew would be called Mizrahi Jews. So again, that umbrella term for Jews who trace their roots to the Middle East and to North Africa, and more generally the Muslim world. Sephardi actually takes us in a slightly different direction. It's been mixed into these terms for a long time, but these days I think people have tried to differentiate a little bit. Sephardi refers specifically to a set of religious practices that emerged among Jews who often lived in the Arab-speaking world. So that's a strange thing because, it's like, well, isn't that the same as Mizrahi? But the difference there is that Sephardic Jews actually trace their roots to Spain and Portugal when it was Al-Andalus, when it was ruled by the Muslim empires. And then Sephardic Jewry spread out both to Europe, to the United States, and throughout the Ottoman Empire and further into the Middle East after the Jews were expelled from Spain and then later Portugal in the 15th and 16th centuries. And so Sephardic is definitely one way in which people can choose to identify that brings together ethnic culture and religious traditions, whereas Mizrahi is more of a geographic designation. Because all of those things get complicated in a time where people move around and move from place to place. But a lot of this it means something when you look at where people are from and how they identify themselves.
Okay, excellent. That's really helpful to get all that nuance between the different terms that you inevitably hear when people are talking about Israeli society. So.
Yeah.
So I think another aspect I wanted to ask you about is that nuance, like how that evolved in film. Maybe again going back to over the past 100 years, like how maybe there were others of many different cultural communities that were represented in a more flat kind of stereotypical way, and then got more depth as time went by. And kind of why is that? Where, maybe also where could it go next in terms of being a more critical of like the dominant view and the othering view?
That's a great question. Let me see if I can take that let me see if I can use that to talk about modern Israeli film more generally. So we can certainly look at others within Israeli society in the context of immigrant films. Because early on, I gave you an example of a 1964 film that looked at the experience of Mizrahi immigrants, so immigrants from the Arab world. But if we fast forward, a couple decades, we have a similar set of films that looks at another large group of immigrants, of Jews in the 1990s, which is Jews coming from the former Soviet Union. This is after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Over the course of the 1990s, give or take, about 1 million Russian-speaking Jews come to the state of Israel. And that's huge. I mean, at that point,
Wow.
these days, Russian-speaking Jews still make up roughly 15% of the overall Israeli population. So it's a huge demographic. But in the 1990s, when they're coming, I mean, 1 million immigrants is huge. In any case, that is registered in film, and the Russians are kind of othered in those films. We also have a smaller but still really significant immigration of Jews from Ethiopia. Really fascinating historical tradition, how Jews ended up in Ethiopia, how and why they chose to immigrate to Israel, small immigrations in the late 70s and early 80s, a larger one in the early 1990s. That really interjects a kind of racial other, although there has been racialization in Israeli films, but a racial other into films that are really just coming out in the past 10 years. We haven't seen much of Ethiopian Israelis in Ethiopian film until a couple really new, exciting films in the past 5 years, even being made by Israeli Ethiopian directors. So that's really new and really interesting. But if I leave immigration for the moment, and obviously we can always come back to it, there are two other areas that I would identify where I think othering is really powerful and gives us a kind of trajectory of films that changes. One of those areas is the representation of Palestinians in Israeli films. Now, it's a bit of a tricky thing to navigate because Israeli films are made by Israeli Jews, but there are also films made by Israeli Palestinians or by individuals who might prefer to refer to themselves as Palestinian citizens of Israel. And we have some really interesting films that take us into both Palestinian society within Israel. So again, we are talking here about Palestinians who are citizens of Israel. There are also films that take us into Palestinians living in the West Bank and Gaza, sometimes called the territories, but different terminology for different things. Really fascinating films there, made by, sometimes by Israelis, sometimes by Palestinians, actually some French films that are really interesting too. And then we also have films that are made by Jewish Israelis or sometimes partnership that really look at relationships. A lot of times love relationships is a particularly effective way for film to take on relationships and some of the trickiness between Jews and Muslims, Jews and Christians, but also Jews and Arabs. So all of these different identity categories floating around. So I'm happy to give examples of all of these, but let me identify one other area I think of othering that's been really interesting in the past 10 years, which is the representation of religion on the screen. Now, what's really striking in Israeli films, really up until, I would say, the 1990s, obviously you can find some scattered examples here and there, but for decades, you really didn't see religiosity on the screen. You didn't see people who were religious, be that Jewish or Muslim or Christian. They just weren't central to these films. And in the past, at this point, getting towards 20 years, that has radically changed. And there are a lot of representations of religious others within Israeli society that have been fascinating to see in film. So I guess kind of multiple choice options there. I'm happy to talk more about any of those areas. I can also give some more specific examples.
Well, I think the love relationships is an intriguing topic and always engaging, and yet can be quite controversial. Like there was an incident recently at Duke. I don't know if you heard about that, but yeah, like something about a song about a girlfriend from the other side, so to speak. And I think that's really interesting. Can you talk about maybe one of your favorite love relationship films that portrays these tensions?
Well, there's so So look, love stories are classic film narratives, right? Think about any films that you've seen, whether or not, I mean, they could be romantic comedies, obviously, which pretty much revolve around some sort of relationship between two potential partners in some way. But even if you're not just simply looking at like a romantic comedy, that love stories drive so many different films, really running the gamut from, you know, war films to comedy to drama, you know, in so many different ways. So in that sense, it's not a surprise that filmmakers will use kind of a love story as an organizing feature, as a genre in a certain sense for the films they're making. I
Mhm.
think it becomes particularly effective when you look at love stories that cut across ethnic, political, and racial lines. I mean, in this sense, if you want to look to like a classic example, um, in the United States, something like West Side Story, right? Which is
Mhm.
remade so many times. But again, or I mean, look, that takes us back to Romeo and Juliet also. So forbidden love, forbidden romance. We have lots of those. You know, there's a really interesting film. It's really hard to actually see these days, unfortunately. I used to teach it, but then the print I was teaching from was such terrible quality. Like I finally gave up on it. But one of the earliest films that really brought a Palestinian into an Israeli Jewish film as a round character, not just as a flat stereotype, you know, the bad guy that you're shooting at or whatever, but as a really nuanced, interesting character was the film Hamsin, which Hamsin refers to kind of a weather phenomenon in the Middle
Mhm.
East.
Yeah.
So it's really hot, dry. Often the sand is blowing. It's like sandstorms that blow off the desert. And for anybody who has experienced that, it is not pleasant, right? This is, you know, not fun in terms of summer, or even oftentimes in the fall, you know, or the spring. It gets you when it's out of season. So they use the weather there as a metaphor in this film. It's from the early 80s. I think it's usually dated 1983, 1984, depending if you're looking at the domestic or the international release. And what happens is you have these two long-standing families. This is up in the Galilee, in the northern part of Israel. A Palestinian family and an Israeli family that have kind of farmed side by side, or I guess they're ranchers. They cattle more than farming. But they have coexisted since, well before the state, and generations have worked together and cooperated with each other. But as the weather gets hotter, that becomes a metaphor for kind of the political situation. Everything, kind of the pressure dialing up, everything is becoming more tense in what had been for really decades or for generations, good relationships between these families. And then it explodes when a young man from the Palestinian family um, starts an intimate relationship. It seems it's a pretty casual thing, an intimate relationship with a young woman from the Jewish family. And that is what sets things off. The political tensions they can deal with, they can work together to work against the government and efforts at land confiscation. But there's something about the intimacy, and here actually the sexual intimacy. This is the first time that we see an intimate sexual relationship between an Israeli Jew and a Palestinian citizen of Israel, represented on screen. Super controversial in the 1980s. And it just kind of explodes at the end of the film in a really kind of hard-hitting, interesting way. But you know, we can contrast that by much more recent films where it's no longer these days within Israeli film. People hardly bat an eye, or at least there are lots of relationships. Of various kinds, but if we're going to stick with kind of intimate relationships or sexual relationships or partnerships between Israeli Jews and Palestinians, we can see lots of them in films. A really interesting example is the 2014 film called Dancing Arabs, based on novels by Saeed Kashua, who's really interesting. He's a Palestinian who writes in Hebrew. And he helped write the screenplay to this film. And there too, you know, it's some of the older generation find a relationship, in this case between high school students, but a woman who is Jewish, a man who is Muslim, Some people find it scandalous, but the film itself and the characters themselves just completely take it for granted, which is really interesting. Although the film itself was released in the middle of the 2014, what in Israel is called the Gaza War, the war between Israel and Gaza, and so that hit some challenges as well in its reception. Another film that I haven't seen, but I'm really looking forward to seeing is I've heard great things about it. It's a 2017 film called In Between, which focuses on three Palestinian women who are living in Tel Aviv, so in the kind of biggest city within Israel, and kind of making their way both in terms of their relationships, but also their careers within the society. So there's just really great stuff here that examines what it means when the other, right, whoever the other was, we can look to Palestinians as well, is no longer so othered nearly as much. A lot of generational conflicts, and then the politics of it too.
Yeah, and the fact that we're seeing more films about cultures by the people from the cultures seems like a very important step toward, getting away from these really problematic aspects of representation.
Yeah, it opens up some really important questions here, I think, in terms of, does it matter whether or not the actor's ethnicity, the actor's religion, or the actor's politics match up with the individual, the character that actor is playing? Typically, these films do cast a type, which is to say they will have Palestinian actors playing Palestinians and Israeli Jewish actors playing Israeli Jews, but that's an open question. Does the identity of the director matter, right? All of these things can be quite controversial depending on how you look at it. One other thing I wanted to flag, by the way, is that I think it's also worth noting that in the last 10 years, while the earlier films were pretty much all heterosexual relationships, so, it would change, where the woman was coming from, where the man was coming from, but it was kind of assumed that the relationships between Israelis and Palestinians were often figured in film in terms of a problematic or struggling or dysfunctional relationship, intimate relationship. These days, we have some really interesting films that also explore other kinds of sexuality, so homosexuality and various other things, and looking at those dynamics too, which I think represents the cultures and as they're changing, right? How the discourse or how people talk about and think about sexuality more generally are changing.
Yeah. Oh, okay. So my mic's on. Sorry, I've been a little distracted by tech because Wi-Fi and things like that. But luckily, we have been able to sustain until now. I think we'll have a good recording. Yeah, I think sexuality. Yeah, I'm glad that kind of was connected to these questions of representation and relationship and diversity. Are there some films you can recommend that explore, like, a love story that's not, I guess, not standard or not from kind of a very heterosexual perspective?
There are several, and I'll recommend some films, but also acknowledge that these films are products of a particular time and place, which is to say, I'm not recommending them because they're perfect films. I think I'm recommending them because they're interesting and they're thought-provoking films. One of the earlier films that I would put in that category is a film called The Bubble, which I believe is 2007, but give or take, it's mid 2000s, and that one definitely explores kind of relationships between Israelis and Palestinians in terms of intimate relationships, and in this case, a relationship between two men. It sensationalizes it a little bit. It very much reflects its time in 2007, where that kind of topic, I think, was new and groundbreaking, whereas now here we are, 15 years later, give or take, after that film, where once again, I think where Israeli society is and where perhaps discourse more generally is, that's not nearly as groundbreaking as a topic as it was in the early 2000s, but that's an interesting one. Not specifically in Israeli and Palestinian films, but one really interesting kind kind of war film, which we haven't talked much about, is a short film called Yossi and Jagger, which also explores homosexuality in the context of the Israeli military, where it has a very different story than it does in the United States, where there have been lots of controversial decisions and different governments making different administrations making decisions about gays in the military. That has a very different story in Israel that we see quite clearly in that film. That's interesting. More recently,
how is it different? How is it different? Like in terms of the way, like the policy around like sexual relationships or sexual identity?
I mean, so here I think this is on the background that military service in the Israeli army is compulsory for all Israeli citizens for about 3 years for men and about 2 years for women. There are many groups within Israeli society who are exempt for various reasons, but sexuality is not one of those reasons for exemption. So there's never been a debate in Israeli society about whether or not gays serve in the military because everybody is drafted. And so instead, as we see in the film Yossi and Jagger, it becomes really interesting just to see how different kinds of sexuality exist in the military, given that, it's not, there are or there aren't, as the debate might be in this country at various points in time, but rather that it is a reality of military service.
Mm-hmm.
But that, of course, builds on a lot of Israeli films that look at the realities and the tensions of military service, which is a whole fascinating genre into itself.
Well, and it would be very different, I think, if, and correct me if I'm wrong, but if a larger percentage of the military was women, like we have women in the American military, but if there was more of like a critical mass of women, I feel like it would be maybe easier to be a woman in the military. But
I think that's a good point.
I'm digressing, but it just, that seems like an interesting dimension.
It changes the dynamic hugely. And there I'll put in a brief plug for a film. This is actually I always have my students vote at the end of the semester of what of the films. We watch about 15 films, what they like the best. And always the past couple of years that I've been using this is a film called Zero Motivation. I think it's from 2017, I want to say, which is about women in the military. But it's a kind of slacker, dark comedy kind of thing. It's not like a war film. It's always one of the most popular. I think it really resonates, certainly for American college students. So that definitely gets into women in the military, which I think you're right, really changes the dynamic. But I wanted to put in a plug or recommendation for another film here while we're talking about relationships and actually sexuality and how that is tied up in representations of Israeli society and specifically diversity in Israeli society, which is actually a documentary. And I know I said at the beginning that I focus mostly on feature films, but this documentary is called Oriented from 2015. They showed it at the WEX a couple of years ago, which is how it came to my attention. And it's really well done. It's a really, I think, nuanced look at sexuality in Palestinian society, although it touches on Israeli society more generally too. And what I think it does so well is it gets past a lot of the stereotyping that we see when it comes to, well, how are gays treated by, Muslim society or Palestinian society. And here I think that's a film that does a particularly interesting job of kind of taking us into that world, kind of where we started out earlier on, the power of film to take us into these worlds. It's not a fictional film, but it's still, I think it really brings us in. Its characters who are featured in it are really remarkable.
Well, and it's a documentary, so these are real people, right? So
they are. Yeah, I mean, I could plug lots more films here too. I really love.
I mean, that makes me think there was an Iranian documentary about a young man and his experiences kind of coming out to his family. And, there were concerns about his safety and things like that. And so, again, for a broad audience, Americans, maybe people in general around the world hear a lot of things about Muslim majority countries or Muslim societies and being very restrictive on sexual identity. And I guess the truth is much more nuanced than that.
Yeah, and what I find interesting, actually, about a couple of the films I mentioned, I mean, this is true about The Bubble, but this is, I think, it's better done and oriented in the documentary, honestly, is that we see that, sexuality is not in a vacuum, right? I mean, it's not just,
Yeah.
what does it mean to identify as a gay man within Palestinian society? I mean, that is part of the film, but that Palestinian society is, in the case of the documentary that I referred to, is within the state of Israel. So, what does it mean to be a minority as a Palestinian within the state of Israel? What does it mean in terms of interactions with various aspects of Israeli society or other Israelis? Their politics there too. At one point, they traveled to a rave in Jordan. What does it mean to be a Palestinian citizen of Israel in another Arab Muslim country? I mean, there are just so many different levels there. And that's where I think it gets so interesting because, again, I would say these issues, hardly any of them exist really in a vacuum. It is that complexity and it is that interwoven nature of, well, in this case, sexuality, but national identity or political identity, ethnic identity, religious identity, all of these things that come together in such complex but such fascinating ways.
Absolutely, absolutely. And how, yeah, like if you cross borders, it can change drastically in terms of like personal safety, but then also just your presentation of self in society and all those multiple intersections that you mentioned. So yeah, I think intersectionality is always really important to keep referring back to whenever we're talking about diversity. So I'm really glad that we got to that. And we are getting close to the end of time. And I want to make sure to ask you just a couple things having to do with, exciting opportunities at OSU, courses you offer, maybe resources you can recommend, and I'd really like to hear what projects you're working on right now that you're busy with as well. So
Okay, let me see. There are lots of things I can tell you. So first of all, let me see if I'll start with kind of the general and some of the film stuff, and then I'll work my way into courses, and then maybe wrap up with a little bit about what I'm focusing on. One of the things that I think is really interesting about Israeli film, and actually we've focused mostly on film and not TV shows, but there's a lot of Israeli TV shows, is that just how accessible they are as foreign films or foreign media these days in the United States. That's because these days there's a lot coming out of Israel thanks to digital production and online streaming. But also because some really interesting things have led to the fact that Israeli films are well represented as foreign films on streaming sites like Netflix and Amazon, stuff that's really easily available. There's also a great collection of Israeli films on Canopy, which is a film streaming service that the university subscribes to. So for anybody who has a university login, you can actually log in and see. Canopy has an amazing selection of foreign films and documentaries in general, but I use a lot of those in my teaching. So one of the things that I think we're really lucky right now is the fact that we can access these films so much more easily than was possible in the past, right? It's not, I mean, with films in general, it's not like you have to go to a movie theater anymore to watch things. But in the case of Israeli films and more other countries as well, there is a ton available if you actually look for it. So if you search for things, or even if you just search on Google, you can say, Israeli films available on streaming sites, or if you go to one of the sites that tells you where things are available, like Just Watch it, you can find all sorts of different things out there. In fact, I think almost all of the films that I've mentioned today are available streaming in one way or another, whether it's specifically through OSU. Sometimes we're able to provide rights to that, or through commercial streaming services. That said, so happy watching. There's great stuff out there to watch, and I think it will give you great insight into Israeli society and its complexity and its diversity. So as you probably picked up on, I really enjoy teaching a class on Israeli film and society. I'll be teaching it again this fall, in fall 2021. I teach the film actually asynchronously online. I know after a pandemic year, maybe people are saying, I don't want to see it online, but I found it actually a really interesting way to look at films together because it gives the opportunity for people to watch the films. They're all streaming in translation online, but then we talk about them. We talk about them on discussion boards. We have all sorts of optional discussions where you can come talk to me in person or online, and students interact with each other. It's a class that's actually worked well online. So if you happen to be an OSU student and you want to learn more, see if it works for you. It's always fun to have students coming from different places in that class. I've talked mostly about film for this session, but I do teach literature as well. In fact, I teach a class that I really enjoy, that I'll be teaching this semester is called Stories of the Middle East and South Asia. If you say, wait a second, that's an awful lot of either a lot of stories or a lot of ground to cover, you are entirely right. But in that class, which I co-teach with my colleague Ila Nagar of the OSU's Department of Near Eastern Languages and Cultures, we basically explore different societies of the Middle East and South Asia through very short stories. So these are all stories that are shorter than 10 pages, in some cases just 1 or 2 pages. But what's amazing is that even in the span of a really short text, it can bring you into these worlds and into family dynamics and politics in these societies and all sorts of other things. I teach lots of other courses too about Israeli culture, about the Bible, about literature more generally too. Always happy to have students, but I think there are great things that you can discover, whether it's in classes or just online or streaming, various things. And the last thing I think that you asked me to touch on really briefly was my own work. We've spent today talking what is, I guess it's somewhere between a teaching, something that I teach and enjoy, and also a hobby of mine, which is to say Israeli media and Israeli film. But I realize that what I'm researching, what I'm writing about these days isn't actually so far. You know, these days I think film is a really effective medium to teach because I think people relate to it. People like watching it, that it brings us in. I'm interested these days in an earlier time, which is to say the middle of the 19th century to the early decades of the 20th century, and what I would call popular fiction. Now, what is popular fiction? Does that mean there's fiction that was not popular? Well, yes and no. But actually, I'm working on these days stuff that some people would call trashy fiction, bad literature, things like that. But I'm interested in it because I'm interested in bestsellers and things that people really read, as opposed to just the things that people were supposed to read or were told they should read or were assigned to read in school. And so I'm really interested in how the story of popular fiction in Hebrew and in Jewish literature more general is a really multilingual story. It draws on a lot of different languages, translations, circulation, and how it also manages to encompass a lot of political, gender, social, and economic issues, how it provides us a really amazing window on the time, even as it creates and crafts these fictional universes that people like to lose themselves in and enjoy. So that's the sort of stuff I'm working on. Lots of things to read and lots of things to watch.
I love that. Yeah, just gives you an entry point into the context in the 19th century, and you're saying up into like the mid 20th century.
Yeah, I'm basically working up until 1948 right now because I'm interested in how, you know, a lot of Hebrew literature is a very political thing. And so what I find really interesting about popular fiction is that for a whole bunch of different reasons, it was seen as bad, objectionable, and bad politically. And I'm curious why things that are popular are, well, why are they bad, right? Why are they seen to be bad? And again, this is in the discourse of the time. I don't think everyone is saying objectively they're bad. Some of them, by the way, objectively are pretty bad. Sometimes I'm like, why am I reading this? This is really bad. But what I think it is that it is a way into a world that has sort of lost us. It's a way into history through literature, through culture that up until now scholars have mostly dismissed and haven't really taken seriously. But what does, you know, I think that when you get beyond way beyond the canonical stuff, way beyond the good,
Mhm.
high literature, and really look at what was selling on the streets, what people couldn't wait to buy the next installment of. It tells you a lot, not only about the people who are writing this sort of fiction, these sorts of bestsellers or the trashy novels, it tells you about the people who are reading them and the world in which they're circulating. And that to me, I think, is really interesting.
Yeah. So windows into other worlds. That's, yeah, I agree. I find that really interesting. And even for the canonical literature, sometimes it can be, especially from the 19th century, a little bit dense, like Dickens or something like that. But if you think of it in terms of like, well, how were people receiving it then? Like, I guess one of my questions could be also, like, especially for the 19th century, were people still reading these out loud to each other? Were they mainly reading them on their own? Were they like novels, or like what, or were they in newspapers? Like what did they look like?
So that's a great question, because this is precisely a time of transition where how people are reading is changing really radically. So, where I start in the project is looking at translations of one of the earliest kind of blockbusters, what's called modern blockbuster, which is a French novel. It was serialized in the press, but it's a French novel called The Mysteries of Paris.
Okay.
And it's translated into Hebrew and into Yiddish, actually into Judeo-Arabic. I mean, it's translated throughout the world, but also throughout the Jewish world in ways that are really interesting, because you could say, why would at this point, a Jewish man or a Jewish woman living in Calcutta, living in Jerusalem, living in Tunis. I mean, again, we have translations from all of these places, living in Vilna, want to read this kind of adventure, somewhat trashy novel about French prostitutes and thieves, and so nobility and hidden identity and plots, and it's all very convoluted, and it's written to keep people reading and be exciting. It's like the literary version of the action flick,
Okay.
pretty. And so why would anybody bother to translate it? Why would people bother to read it? But
Right.
what's interesting is that this is one of the earliest blockbusters to be put in this kind of way in circulation. We've got some really important changes going on in print and literacy in Europe.
Okay.
And then that too will show changes and aspirations within Jewish societies in various places. So by translating, you kind of make a claim that you sort of want to be like the French, you want to be modern, you want to be literary.
Hmm.
You're not so sure about these French prostitutes, like that's pushing it a little far, but it's
Right.
drawing people in. So in those early years, people are handing the booklets from person to person. It's buying books is still a luxury. But by the 1940s, when I'm wrapping up the project, there are chapbooks, there are little booklets being sold on newsstands, on the street. Like, everything's affordable. It's a couple cents that daily laborers can still, take a little, if they have just a little bit of pocket money, they can buy these, and they are buying these. So one of the reasons why we have kind of mass market literature emerge over precisely this time is because it suddenly becomes possible, and people have just a little bit of disposable income. They have the skills to read. They have the interest in reading. And of course, this is a time before TV. It's large. There are films still, but films are still quite expensive. There's radio a bit, and this will
Mhm.
start to decline as radio really takes off. But this is a really important way for people to be entertained. But that entertainment, I would argue, also conveys a lot
And
of messages.
for our younger viewers, radio also included storytelling more. I mean, yeah, like we might be reading some of these stories much more. It'd be much more common than, I don't know. It's so hard to compare media eras, isn't it? Like, because now we have everything. Like, yeah, like,
I mean, except that I think sometimes our media, while the media forms change and look different, I think, first of all, the kind of basic desire for entertainment, for getting lost in stories, for being
mhm,
drawn up into other worlds, I don't think that's new.
Yeah.
Okay. No, like 100
Right.
years ago, people were not watching like YouTube series or, various other, these days with social media, there's so many new forms and there are people who are experimenting and doing really interesting things, both, kind of things that don't seem serious at all, that just seem kind of ridiculous. But also you can find really fascinating stuff on TikTok. You really can, as a medium, and what people do and how they use it really well to tell stories of various kinds. And to me, okay, the form is new, but that impulse is not new. It's not just like in the past, however many years, that suddenly people wanted to have social media to connect to people, to lose themselves in different stories or different places. No, that goes way back. So here it's just looking at the different technologies and the ways of doing that. And to me, the time period I'm looking at is a really interesting transitional time where suddenly people can
Very much
access
so.
new kinds of culture and new people.
Very interesting cultural moment. It's fascinating. Like just how, like you're talking about, it's also before TV. Like I think that before TV moment is very cool. So thank you for, kind of illuminating that period. And it was really a period of really fast change and evolution too, with the economic, like you're saying, finally sort of typical people could afford to buy a little story, like a booklet.
Yeah.
And that was like a new thing. And before that, people would have to sort of like pass books around because they were too expensive. But, and I imagine they probably read them out loud too. I think, well, still, I mean,
Really.
I think there's still stories that people read out loud and crowds still gather. And maybe at another time we could talk about that, like just, in Israel, like how popular poetry readings are and different ways that people experience stories in Israel would be really interesting to talk about as well. So
Definitely. Yeah.
but I'm
Great.
afraid we've run out of time. But if there's anything else you want to share before we wrap up, it's up to you. We can stay as long as you like.
Well, let me just say thank you. It's been a pleasure talking to you. I think we've covered a lot of different areas. There's always more. And so, if any of the listeners ever want to reach out to me, they're welcome to do so. You can find me through OSU. But thank you, Melinda, for the opportunity to talk today. And it was a great conversation.
Yeah, thank you. I really enjoyed it. And I think our listeners will too. So I really appreciate it. Thank you so much for taking some time out for Keys to Understanding the Middle East podcast. And I'm going to wrap it up right there.